There we go. All right, how does that look?
Yeah, I can see it just great.
All right, great. Well, thanks for inviting me to talk here today, Ali. This is great. This is a super important part of putting in habitat for pollinators. So it's good that we're kind of focusing on this today. Site preparation can really determine how well habitat does in the long run, and especially with your weeds as your habitat grows in. So this is great to be here, and it's great to be a part of the SARE grant that that you guys received. So my name's Corin Pease. I am the Pacific Northwest Pollinator Habitat Specialist with the Xerces Society, and I also hold a partner biologist position with the NRCS, the Natural Resource Conservation Service. So I imagine a lot of you have heard of the Xerces Society, but just a quick introduction. Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation was founded in 1971. We were founded by Dr. Robert Michael Pyle as a butterfly conservation organization in 1971, and we take our name from the Xerces blue butterfly, which is a now extinct butterfly that used to occur on the coast of California in the dunes around San Francisco Bay Area. And due to development, that species went extinct. And so this organization was formed to prevent insect extinctions and educate people on insect and now invertebrate conservation. We do work in many different areas, including pollinators, endangered and aquatic species, pesticide work, and also work in urban areas with habitat for invertebrates. We use restoration, research, education, outreach, and advocacy to further our mission. So I'm going to do a quick overview on why we want to put in pollinator habitat. Obviously, pollinator populations have seen a decline recently over many years, really. Insects in general have seen population collapses and have been documented in many research studies. So, what do pollinators need to be able to survive? Of course, they need pollen and nectar. And they need nesting and overwintering sites, and they also need nest materials to build their nests. In addition to bees, natural enemies, some of our are important for pest management in our agricultural crops, are also have basically the same habitat requirements. They also need pollen and nectar and overwintering sites, and in addition, they need many of them need prey or a host to reproduce in. And so these habitats we're talking about today can serve as habitat for both our important pollinators and also natural enemies of crop pests. So here's just start out with this great example of a native pollinator habitat in the Willamette Valley alongside a blueberry planting. So the question here today is, how do you get to this point? I don't see many weeds out there. There's a little bit of wild carrot, but not many weeds in this planting. How do we get from just a weedy patch to this kind of habitat? So the whole process, there's many different steps in the planning, planting, and maintenance process. So today I'll be focusing on this initial part here, site selection, which plays a big role in the success of a planting, and then site preparation. So we'll talk about the steps in site preparation and different techniques you can use to prepare your site for pollinator habitat. So what are the important things to think about before you select the site for a habitat? Well, one important thing is pesticide drift. You want to locate the habitat far enough away from areas that are sprayed with insecticides, also herbicides that can damage the plants that you intend on planting. You know, that distance can vary depending on how insecticides are applied. You know, anywhere from 30 to 60 feet, depending on whether they are being applied with just a regular sprayer or with air assist air blast sprayers, or by aerial application. So you know, we're not going to get into the details of that, but if you want more information, there's some good information on the Xerces website. Accessibility, it's important to be able to access the habitat area, to be able to maintain the area, whether it's mowing or managing the weeds and other manners, herbicides, to keep it looking good and establishing well. Sunlight, of course, most of pollinator habitat prefers full sunlight. Of course, there are some species of plants that can tolerate some shade that also provide habitat for pollinators, but really the best is full sun. Slope is really important to consider, especially if you're doing a seeding, because you know, highly in steep sites, highly erodible areas, you don't want you want to be able to plant it without the soil getting washed away before the plants are established. Also take into account what's occurred on the site recently, what the current plant cover is, the weeds present, whether there have been herbicides, pre-emergent herbicides specifically, or other non-residual herbicides have been used in the area. Also keep in mind, you know, what the drainage is, because that'll help you determine what plants may be able to survive in that spot. Yeah, it's good to know what kind of soil type you have in the area. Weed pressure, which I'll be focusing much of my talk on today, is really one of the most important areas to focus on here. Many habitat areas, especially if they're being planted with transplants, irrigation is super important, even in Western Washington. irrigation for hedgerows or other transplanted habitat areas is pretty important to help get it off to a good start. Um, drip irrigation is the best. Often the plants will need like 2 or 3 years of irrigation. You never know, we're going to have kind of a dry summer here, and it's best to be prepared for that. I've seen enough failures in the last few years from lack of water that this is something that shouldn't be overlooked. So it's important to have access to water. And then keep in mind other dual purpose aspects of the habitat. Native habitat like this can also help prevent runoff or create have stream bank stabilization, create other habitat for other wildlife. And also can serve as multifunctional habitat that provides some harvestable products. So like I said, weed pressure is kind of one of the most important aspects of selecting a site. So you want to really avoid, I suggest that you avoid areas that really have high weed pressure. It's not to say that those areas can't be eventually create a good habitat space. It may take many years to fight back weeds such as blackberry or Canada thistle, other kind of invasive weeds, reed canary grass is another one. So yeah, just kind of keep in mind it's easiest to pick a site that doesn't have high weed pressure. You want to pick sites that don't have persistent year-round cover of these type of weeds. You want to pick a site sites that haven't been actively growing and producing seed for a number of years, ideally. Areas that are mowed where the weeds don't have the chance to reseed readily are also good choices. Yeah, and also stay away from sites dominated by sod-forming grasses and rhizomatous weeds.
I'm blocking the view because that's exactly what I'm trying to do. Oh, God, you're not losing weight, you're gaining weight.
All right, so what are some of the problem weeds we want to be aware of? Well, it depends on what kind of habitat you're putting in. Hedgerow projects and other transplanted habitat are going to be a little bit different, and we can tolerate a little bit higher weed issues in those areas. But three of the main species that pop up time and time and again as being difficult to control and establish hedgerows or transplanted habitat in our Canada thistle, Himalayan blackberry, of course, and field bindweed can really also be problematic, climbing all over newly transplanted plants. Native seeding projects, you're going to want to keep an eye on, make sure there's not some broader range of problematic weeds. Here's a few, the same three species that I mentioned there: Canada thistle, field bindweed, Himalayan blackberry, but also creeping bentgrass, white clover, false dandelion, cat's ear, ryegrass, and shiny geranium are just a few of the major ones you need to be aware of. That it's going to make a native seeding project more difficult, and yeah, certainly really difficult to establish a good habitat without these weeds coming back, um, without use of herbicides. It's possible to, with 2 or 3 years of site prep to establish habitat with some of these weeds present, but if it's overwhelming number of these type of invasive weeds, then I would just pick a different spot. So yeah, number one reason why habitat projects fail is poor site prep. I see a lot of failures because the work wasn't done up front to set up the project for success. So weed competition is often why I see projects fail. And it's easier to put in this work before planting with good site prep than to struggle with weed problems after planting. So the first step in site preparation is to remove the existing vegetation. Think about what the future condition of the planting bed and requirements for your planting techniques. So right up front, you know, to the left there, you can see a typical situation. There's always going to be plants on the site. And so you're going to need to remove that vegetation in some way. Also part of this step right up front is if you're planning on doing a seeding, this step should also include creating a seed bed, making sure there's no hard pans, doing some good tillage to prep the site for seeding. You may also need to do that if you're transplanting plants, if the soil has been compacted and needs to be loosened before planting. So think about that up front before you do a lot of major weed control. So there are a number of ways to accomplish the first step. Some work better than others. What works? Some of these things work in combination with others. So things that work: solarization, occultation. I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Herbicides definitely work. Plowing, disking, harrowing to kind of loosen those compacted soils is important and work. Multiple tillage events, tillage to reduce the vegetation that's there and create that seed bed. Those things work. With some of these techniques, you'd want to probably combine solarization, occultation, which is just silage tarping, or herbicides. You might need to combine that with tillage to create a good seed bed for planting seeds. But some of these techniques alone would be adequate for putting in hedgerow or transplanted habitat. What doesn't work? Just plain grazing, mowing, or using organic burn down herbicides really is not effective at removing the existing vegetation. So moving as we move into the second step here of site preparation, we should think about the seed bank cycle. Looking at the seed bank, there are a number of ways to affect the seed bank on the site. Plants can be prevented from going to seed. That'll increase seeds on the surface. And seeds can be forced to germinate as well and then killed before reseeding. or seeds could be killed in the soil by heat. So that would will be what you'd be doing with solarization. The seed bank you can hold millions of seeds, so many seeds in there, and really tillage can help, obviously with removing the vegetation that's there. But tillage alone often makes it difficult to reduce this seed bank, because you're constantly bringing up seeds from lower down in the soil profile that may be dormant. And if you use deep tillage, you're often just kind of in a continuous cycle of bringing up new seed that's dormant up to the surface of the soil where it can germinate. So these are some of the things you kind of want to think about when thinking about the soil seed bank. So step 2 would be to reduce that weed seed bank. This is really the most critical factor in the success of planting, like I've said before. One technique that does work is repeated herbicide treatments. You never want to let any of the weeds go to seed during the site prep time period. As often as every 6 weeks in the early spring and into summer. You just really don't want to let those weeds get higher than 4 or 6 inches, keeping them back, keeping the growth back. That's effective for site prep, and that kind of site prep for a year will result in a good site prep, especially if you don't have some perennial weeds in there, like I was mentioning earlier. Similarly, repeated flame weeding. If your organic flame weeding can be a great tool to use instead of herbicides, and so you get those weed seedlings as they germinate. Keep in mind that you've created this. You might have, if you're seeding, you create a seed bed that has no seeds on it, and then you just want to kind of come in with that flame weeding every 4 weeks or so. Keep those weeds from establishing, growing up, and producing seed. That's the most important thing. Solarization, again, solarization or occultation can also be a great method. I mentioned in the step 1, it can be used in step 1 to remove the vegetation, but as well as reducing the weed seed bank. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. Repeated shallow tillage. Like I said before, it's not the most effective way of site prep. There are ways to try to germinate weeds, but if it's not super shallow tillage, you're just bringing up more weed seed the whole time. And if you have a seed bank that's full of weed seed, this is going to be a difficult method to really have adequate site prep. Heavy mulching or a weed barrier. These are things that are effective for transplanted habitat. It's things like sheet mulching or using a landscape fabric are effective for keeping the weeds back before planting and also after planting. So you have a little bit more leeway when you're putting in transplanted habitat. I'll go a little bit into detail on soil solarization. This is a pretty effective method, I have to say, though. In Western Washington, Western Oregon, it's a difficult method to implement, although I've seen it done well. There's few things to keep in mind. So solarization is a method of heating up the soil to kill the weeds and weed seeds. So it actually sterilizes the surface of the soil a few centimeters down, killing killing weed seeds, also kills pathogens and whatnot in the soil as well. Like it says here, it's most effective in warm climates. So you're going to want to hopefully, we have like a good sunny summer, and it can be effective that way. You know, it's important to it's important to keep it all sealed and whatnot. I'll just take a look at how the process looks here. So this is these photos here are from a actually, I think it I don't know if this might have been the planting that you saw at the beginning of the presentation there, but this was in the Willamette Valley, and we successfully did this. First step was to create a good seed bed, so cultivating to create that seed bed in the springtime, and then getting that getting that plastic down in late spring or early summer is super important. So you need that duration of like at least 3 months here. If you don't have at least 3 months, it's probably not going to be very effective. So 3 to 6 months, the longer the better. Of course, as you get into fall, temperatures start decreasing, so it's less effective. Really is to try to hit that time period bracketing the summer solstice, when the sun is highest in the sky. So you want to keep it on there for at least 3 months, and remove it in fall, just prior to planting, and you don't want to till at all. That'll just bring up seeds, like I said, from deeper in the soil profile. And you also want to use a high quality 4 or 6 mil UV stabilized plastic, clear plastic. So this is the type of plastic you'd use on a high tunnel, or something like that. Very important to have also UV stabilized, but also it's important to have the anti-condensate on there, and that's something a lot of greenhouse plastics have. So just using any old clear plastic is not going to be great. Number one, it'll break down in the sun, and number two, you'll have water condensing on the underside of the plastic, and that's just going to help weeds grow underneath that plastic layer. Also, all the edges with solarization the plastic needs to be buried and sealed off. That is super important. If you don't have it all sealed, you won't reach the temperatures you need to be able to kill the weed seeds there. So yeah, seal all the sides by burying all the sides. And then also any rips, we've had folks try this, and then the deer get on it and they break holes in it, and then it starts to blow away, and you really can't have that. You need to be on it, put it back on, and then repair it with like that tape that you can use to repair greenhouse plastic. So it's important to keep it sealed as long as you can.
And Corin, we had a question in the chat about what the area in the pictures in this slide looked like before site prep. Was it cropped or was it soddy?
Yeah, this site was on the edge of a crop field, so it did have some grass in it. You can kind of see it in the bottom left there. It had grass on it. I don't think there was a lot of like bent grass or anything, sod forming grasses in it, though. Kind of your general weeds. It didn't have many perennial weeds in it. So you know, it's a good location to start out with. I think a lot of your perennial weeds will make it through this process, and even small bits of the root that are still there won't necessarily get entirely killed by solarization. So it's important, like I said before, to pick a good site. So I had mentioned, so a lot of farmers, small farmers, are using what they call occultation, and this is basically using silage tarps to block out the light from an area and prep it, and often used kind of on a shorter time scale than I'd recommend for habitat, but often used on farms to prep areas before planting vegetables, and you know, it's highly effective for that. I'd like to see more of it tried for putting in perennial pollinator habitat. What I'd recommend with this is that uh, it remains on there from the fall before you're going to plant all the way into the following fall, and you might need to pull it off occasionally to get some germination of the weeds, and then pull it back over and keep it covered in between times. You got to make sure that you got sandbags or something to hold it down. So what are the big differences between solarization and occultation? Solarization is only effective in the sun. Silage tarping doesn't need sunlight. It does heat up the soil, but what you're really trying to do here is block the light. So you want to use opaque covering. So yeah, like silage tarp with the white on the bottom side and the black side on the top. The edges don't need to be sealed on that, as opposed to the solarization. And like I said, yeah, you want to keep it down for much longer than you would solarization plastic. And the verdict's out a little bit on this method. I'd like to see more people try it. Whether it reduces the weed seed bank as much as it does with solarization, because you're not really heating the soil to those temperatures that you are with soil solarization. But I think it is an effective alternative, and lots of folks out there have those silage tarps on their small farms, and they're already using them for prep for vegetable planting. So it's something to take a look at and see how it works. Yeah, let me know how it goes. I have a few people trying it here recently, and we'll see how well it works. But I have some hope that it'll be a good method. So one thing I didn't mention was solarization. It's super important to have, when you first put that down, you put down the plastic, make sure to irrigate, soak the soil really well. If it's been dry out, let's say you're getting out in later June or whatnot, maybe it hasn't rained. It's important to make sure that soil is fully soaked before putting that down, because part of the effect is that steam that's created from heating the soil and the water in the soil. Okay, so herbicide is a really good, herbicides are a really good effective tool to get this native habitat established. You want to use, generally you want to use non-selective, non-persistent herbicides. Some herbicides stick around longer than others. I'll touch briefly on that in a bit. First, you want to start by prepping the area with light tillage or a close mow, and then you want to start your applications in early spring and continue for 6 to 9 months before planting. If your site has heavy weed pressure, you may need to go 2 seasons of site prep to really reduce your weeds, so you get good establishment. Yeah, and always make sure you spray before those weeds go to seed. Ideally, they shouldn't get more than 6 inches tall before you spray. And as always, you want to avoid any additional tillage because they'll just kind of set you back and bring up more seeds. Always you want to wait 72 hours after an application of herbicide. Though some herbicides, so that would be for like glyphosate, Roundup. Some herbicides have a residual and may last for quite long time periods. So I wouldn't do broadcast applications of some other herbicides. We'll touch on the details in a second here. You want to remove most, so you either want to close mow or till it before spraying herbicides. If there's a lot of dead vegetation on the surface, you're not going to be able to get penetration of the herbicide down into where the seedlings are starting to grow. So keep that in mind as well. Always, when using herbicides, keep in mind, always read the entire label and follow it exactly. Use proper PPE, read the label, wear your proper personal protective equipment. Don't spray when it's windy. If it's completely still and we have an inversion layer, that's also a problem with some herbicides. So keep in mind, you want just a little bit of breeze, a few miles per hour of wind is fine, but if it's any more than just a little breeze, you'd probably want to pick a better time to do it. Don't spray when there's high temperatures out. So when it's forecasted to reach more than 80 degrees or higher, try to pick another time. And then be super careful when spraying large areas or when spraying areas near sensitive plants or crops. We want to avoid damaging the surrounding vegetation. So here's where I'm going to get into some details here. I am not, just a disclaimer, I'm not making any herbicide recommendations here. I'm just sharing some information that's available on the Pacific Northwest Weed Management Handbook. I'd refer to this handbook for any details on rate information or any specific uses of herbicides for control of specific weed problems. It's a great resource. I would use it also. So either use resources like that to get your information, or consult a licensed pest control consultant for the state of Washington. So I don't have that license in Washington, so just a disclaimer. Generally, use of glyphosate is Roundup. It will serve most of your needs here. That's a broad spectrum herbicide that kills many grasses and broadleaves. It's non-selective, so it will kill or damage many plants. So yeah, be careful with it. It is non-residual, which means after you spray it, it's not going to be lingering in the soil or so that you can plant soon after the application of Roundup. Like I said, you probably want to wait like 72 hours or something just to be sure. So that's pretty wide spectrum. There are some times when you may need to use more specific herbicides. 2,4-D is goes by many different trade names. It's a broadleaf selective herbicide and doesn't have any residual as well. So pretty widely available. And all these products here are not restrictive use pesticides. You don't need an applicator license for any of these, as far as I know. Many are available in home and garden sources, as well as some farm supply stores. So glyphosate is not going to be effective at, or 2,4-D are not going to be effective at eradicating real problem weeds such as blackberry, English hawthorn, like these woody species, Scotch broom, poison oak. You're going to have to use a stronger herbicide for those. Triclopyr, Garlon would be an option there. Again, do your research before using it. Make sure you read the label. I would recommend with these spot spraying. I guess I'm not recommending, but make sure you're not spraying it everywhere, because it will kill lots of species. But it is selective on broadleaves, so it won't kill grasses. Yeah, so Canada thistle, clovers, and tansy ragwort, and some other hard to control perennial weeds. You might look at products like aminopyralid is a good one. Milestone is the product. And then there's also products, I'm not going to go into detail, that are grass selective and non-residual as well. And so those will kill grasses, but they won't kill broadleaf plants. Important to keep in mind when using herbicides that some herbicides do affect pollinators. So the ones here that I've outlined do affect, there's evidence that they affect honeybee brood development. So glyphosate, 2,4-D, and sethoxidime post. Those herbicides on this list do affect honeybee brood, and this is according to UCIPM bee precaution website, which is a website I use often to determine the effects of different insecticides, herbicides, and fungicides on bees. So what they say there is that these products are toxic to honeybee brood and should not be applied to flowering plants, right? Or be allowed to contaminate water accessible to bees. Super important to keep in mind, if bees are visiting the plants and they bring these residuals back to the hive, they can damage their offspring. So applying only when the weeds are not in the flowering stage and when there isn't ponding water in the area. These products can be important tools for for restoration and establishing native plants and are used effectively. But again, always consult a licensed pest control consultant, and always read the label. You know, that's what I recommend. Okay, so I'm going to go through a couple examples here. We're at 3 o'clock. I'm going to go through a couple examples of what site prep might look like in a few situations. So this one is a hedgerow site prep example for an organic farm with medium weed pressure. So you would till to prep the site in spring, and then immediately install solarization plastic like we talked about, and remove that plastic, then keep that plastic down all the way through summer, and then remove it in September when the rains start. And then soon after you remove that plastic, if you're going to put it in a hedgerow, then you would apply a good layer of mulch and then plant into that mulch, you know, in the late fall or early winter time period. If you weren't going to do that, if you weren't playing a hedgerow, you could also kind of do this site prep like this, and plant seeds immediately after pulling the plastic off in September. Here's an example of a hedgerow site prep for a conventional farm with low weed pressure. You would mow the area in spring, spray with a broad spectrum non-residual herbicide, apply herbicide as needed in May, July, and into late September as you need to, keeping in mind that you don't want those weeds to go to seed, and really shouldn't let them get more than 4 or 6 inches. So here's an example of site prep for seeding. You want to, up front, you want to prep your seed bed. So in this example is looking at starting in summer or fall, a year before planting. And so the idea here is that you're controlling all the weeds that would come up in the fall, and then all the way spring germinating weeds and summer germinating weeds. So you're catching the whole season. So you would till in early summer, create that seed bed, or fall, and then you can either spray or flame the weeds. I think it also, you could insert occultation into this as well, and you just, instead of spraying the whole time, you would just prevent weeds from growing with a silage tarp during this time period. So spray or flame, continue spraying or flaming through the spring, continue through summer of the next year, and into fall, and then so that would be a year from when you started, and then take a note of, at that point, you know, how the weed pressure is progressing. If it's still really high weed pressure at that point, I would recommend going a second year through this process to further reduce the weed seeds and the weed seed bank. But you know, if if you reduce the weeds enough, just a light harrow, real surface, as shallow as possible, break up that surface crust on the soil, and immediately seed afterwards in the fall. So those are kind of 3 different examples of how the process would go. You know, there's lots of details of your site that may make some differences in exactly how you'd proceed, but thought I'd give you a few examples of how to how this actually works. So let's see, where are we at here, Allie? Are we moving into question time or?
Sure. Yeah, I've been collecting the questions in the chat as we go. So if now would be a good time, I can put those to the group. Perfect. All right. We had a few questions about what might be the effects on the microbiology of the soil when you're doing solarization and occultation. Do you have thoughts on that, or and also on soil nutrient, if there's any effects there?
Okay, so soil solarization is used for plant pathogen control, so it will have some effect on the soil microbiology. But what I've found and what some of the research out there has shown that are beneficial microorganisms that aren't dependent on plants to survive are going to reside lower in the soil and be able to repopulate that top layer of the soil over time. The plant pathogens are more dependent on having plants there. They're often shallower in the soil, and it's easier, so it's more likely going to damage them than our good microbiology in the soil. Even with the plant pathogens, it sets it back for maybe a year, and then you gradually have those species come back. I wouldn't be super worried about it because a lot of the microbes inhabit pretty deep down into the soil, and they can repopulate that surface area.
Okay. Yeah, and do you ever think about inoculating seed to help that process? There was a question in the chat about that.
Yeah, I mean, you never know what symbionts that may be in the soil before, and then you might eliminate. I don't often recommend, just because I don't think it always helps, but I think I would love to see more research on it, but I think there is probably some benefit from putting mycorrhizae in the soil with transplanted perennial woody plants. You may get better establishment, but I would keep in mind what plant species you're working with and what the mycorrhizae that are associated with those plant species are, and make sure you're using the proper species that have developed those relationships.
Thanks. We also had a number of questions in the chat, folks looking for a little more information on mulching, anywhere from using cardboard as a mulch, and then layering that with mulches like manure or compost or straw. If you have any recommendations around that, to give some guidance for folks looking to use those resources.
Yeah, there's the idea of sheet mulching, where you have kind of many layers of cardboard and organic materials. Pretty effective kind of over kind of a long term establishing a planting area. You kind of want to need some of that stuff to decompose before you plant into it. What I often see that works well and kind of extends the lifetime of a organic mulch like wood chips is putting a layer of cardboard underneath those wood chips. Can extend, let's say you just put down 3 or 4 inches of wood chips alone, may be effective for one season, at preventing the weed habitat. But having a layer of cardboard under there, a layer or two of cardboard, extends that out maybe another year or something, and kind of prevents weed growth over that time period. But being in Western Oregon or Western Washington, those things decompose a lot quicker than they do maybe on the east side of the Cascades.
And do you have thoughts on using manure as a mulch, or?
What was that? I missed that.
Oh, sorry. Do you have thoughts on using manures as a mulch or composts?
Well, manures have a lot of weed seed in them, and unless they're fully composted, I wouldn't use manure. Compost, I think would be fine, although I don't think it sets up the right conditions for native plant establishment. Generally, I don't recommend too much compost, maybe just a tad in the planting hole, but these native plants are not used to high nutrient environments, and that's kind of the environment where those weeds are going to be more successful at growing and competing. And so adding compost, I think, might present a more difficult situation with more weed growth and less of your natives, less growth with your natives because of that weed competition. That's my thought.
Yeah. Cool. We also had a number of questions about using seed drills for seeding. If you could talk a little bit about how to do that and what advantages there are.
Sure, we're not really talking about the planting part of the process. This is really more site prep. But yeah, seed drills, there's, it is a way to plant seeds without like a no-till seed drills. You can minimize soil disturbance and bring up more weed seed. So in the context of weed management, it's possibly beneficial to use a no-till seed drill. It's placing the seed, at the right spot. Other drills, you're going to need to prep the soil just as much as you would if you're broadcast seeding. So yeah, I don't know exactly what the question was there, but yeah, I mean those seed drills are an effective way at seeding natives. There's a lot of different types of seed drills, and there's details there. I don't really want to get into the details, but if there's interest, maybe we can do another talk about the planting process.
Yeah, and just a note for the group that the Pierce Conservation District does have a no-till drill, and we do have a native seed box on it. So we've had a couple people use it for planting native seeds, and it's a nice tool. I guess, Corin, too, I've also heard that drills can be effective when you're trying to sort of revitalize a wildflower planting, to kind of get in there once in a while and rustle up the thatch and maybe renovate with some fresh seed. Is that true?
Yeah, real close mow before you do that, with a flail mower, or perhaps even if you have the chance to burn a site before doing that. A lot of these natives can tolerate burning, and then following through with a no-till drill can really revitalize the site that's maybe gotten a little weedy over the years or whatnot, especially if you have native grasses in there. To try to get through the thatch of established native grasses is difficult, unless they're really mowed super low or burnt. But yeah, that's a great way to revitalize the planting, easier with forbs. But either way, you can do it.
Great. And we've got some notes in the chat that other districts have a drill or are getting one. So districts are really getting those on board more and more. So
yeah, it's great. I'm glad to see that. It's always good to know that that's available for folks, because it is an easier and often more effective way of seeding natives than broadcast.
we also had some questions about, what's the balance between doing the site prep and then disturbing ground nesting bee habitat? Are there any tips on that, or is it sort of unavoidable? But then
Yeah.
you get
So I would keep in, there's a lot. Xerces website has a lot of resources on how to identify ground nesting bee areas that are inhabited by ground nesting bees. You'll often see holes that maybe a lot of people think are like ant holes or something. They kind of look like little volcanoes. If you're concerned about that, I would make sure you kind of survey the area beforehand, do some monitoring before, like in the summer and spring and summer, before disturbing the area. You can often see native bees accessing those nests, and then you'll have an idea if they're there already. Yeah, so I would keep that in mind. It's important. Often you can determine if it's already being used. If it's being used as a nesting site, then I'd avoid it. Some it depends on the species. But I don't expect a lot of people to be able to determine the species of their native ground nesting bees, but some are more resilient to tillage than others, depending on the depth of their nest holes and whatnot. But yeah, I would do some monitoring beforehand.
And we also have a note here, just to be a cautionary note about skewing the carbon to nitrogen ratio with mulches, and how that can also get you into a little trouble if you're overly mulching and then trying to get in there right away and do some planting.
Especially if you're planting into the mulch and the plant roots are in the mulch. Like I was mentioning sheet mulching before, which involves a really deep mulches that need kind of time to decompose and work that carbon and nitrogen ratio out before planting. It's important to consider, but often mulches that are isolated on the top 3 or 4 inches, and you're planting the roots down below that area, the carbon on the surface won't affect the nitrogen availability deeper in the soil. So if it's just a surface mulch and your plant roots are not inhabiting that area, then I wouldn't be super concerned about it. But yes, a lot of mulch, and if you end up planting it in that mulch, then you can have issues with that for sure.
Super. We are running a little short on time. I think what I'll do is we're going to save the chat for this meeting, and I will work on following up with questions that we didn't get to today. But since we're getting to 3:30, I'd like to go ahead and have Marley, our AmeriCorps, just share a little bit of what she would like us to do in the chat in terms of what pledges you might be thinking of doing in response to what you learned today. And so we'll take 5 minutes for that, and then I'll just end with pointing you in the direction of some good resources for going even beyond site prep. for establishing pollinator habitat, and then also highlighting some